just a bit of business. Please hold your questions until the end of Rachel's presentation. Diana Rice-Shahan and Robin Wilkerson, ecological gardeners extraordinaire, will join Rachel to answer your questions after her talk. We are so grateful to Bryn Gingrich of the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust for her tech wizardry in running the Zoom tonight. We are going to record this talk and we'll share the recording in a follow-up email, as well as post it on our website, lincolncommonground.com. And now I will pass to Diana, who will share some words and introduce Rachel. And with special thanks to Nell Hood of the Wild Seed Project for recent inspiration about our relationship with the living earth. To Diana.
Hello, my name is Diana Rice-Shahan, and I am also a member of Lincoln Common Ground. It's wonderful to see all of you. Why are we here? For so many reasons. Because we are part of an interconnected web of relationships. We are here to learn about the unseen, what is happening in the interwoven and dynamic web of life underground that enhances climate resilience and creates soil health. How do we honor those relationships? How do we move towards reciprocity in a world that favors extraction? By being here, you are showing your love for all beings and your commitment to learning a new way of engaging with the land. I want to start tonight with gratitude for this incredible place we call home and for the opportunity to learn and unlearn how we show up. Gratitude for the birds eagerly building their nests. Gratitude for the brave green shoots peeking through the ground. Gratitude for the buds bursting forth with each warm day. As we celebrate the miracle of spring, let's ask ourselves, what does it mean to build and rebuild reciprocal relationships with people, plants, fungi, water, soil, and air? We are gathered on the unceded lands of the Massachusetts and Nipmuc peoples. We acknowledge that this land on which we live, work, and garden is ancestral land that has been inhabited and stewarded by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years before any settlers arrived, co-creating this thriving ecosystem. They continue to live and thrive on the land that was violently taken from countless leaders, communities, and elders. Let us honor the enslaved people who built the wealth and foundation of Lincoln and didn't have ownership or equal access to it. As inhabitants and stewards of this landscape, we commit to sustaining and supporting the natural life and all living beings of this place. We commit to working towards healing and reconciliation amongst all people. We commit to learning more about the Indigenous peoples of this land and their history, and to supporting Indigenous-led organizations. With immense love and gratitude for this place we call home, we do our part in bringing about greater healing for all peoples, for all landscapes, for all beings, and all future generations who will live here. We're so grateful to Rachel Neurath for sharing her extensive expertise and passion for the miracle of life underground. Rachel is a soil microbial ecologist and a member of Lincoln Common Ground. Her research focus is on the role of plant microbe soil interactions in carbon storage. Rachel grew up in Lincoln and moved back with her family 2.5 years ago. As one of our Lincoln Common Ground Soil sisters said recently, Rachel is a local Lincoln treasure. And now to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today with everyone. And I wanted to start by acknowledging that this talk is part of an ongoing relationship that Lincoln Common Ground has with the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust and the Lincoln Garden Club. And Lincoln Common Ground sees ourselves as connectors with other organizations in Lincoln. And we've been doing No Mow May and thinking about ecological gardening in collaboration with lots of other organizations in Lincoln. And together with Lincoln Land Conservation Trust and the Lincoln Garden Club, we have decided to sort of follow the Lincoln Garden Club's lead this spring on thinking about ground covers. So that's why the focus here is ground covers. And hopefully by the end, you'll also be excited about the idea of planting ground covers. And I just wanted to read one of our pieces of philosophy from Lincoln Common Ground, which is that we have the opportunity here on our common ground to heal the soil, increase above and below ground biodiversity, and seed beneficial, resilient plants that will heal the land and through it ourselves. And the whole concept of planting ground covers is part of our No Mow May movement, which is a growing global movement. And we're calling this No Mow May and beyond, because this is year 3 of trying to encourage No Mow May. And so many Lincolnites have already started doing No Mow May, and it's really exciting. And if you haven't done No Mow May or want to learn more, I encourage you to look at the Lincoln Common Ground website, which is lincolncommonground.com. And we have lots of information on what No Mow May is. But the idea is that a lot of pollinators, really important beneficial insects, rely on early sources of nectar from flowers that might emerge in May, and the habitat from longer grass and flowers emerging in May. And so delaying mowing through the month of May gives an opportunity for those pollinators to emerge. So the idea is to wait to do your first mow until those insects get that really important first start to the season. And when you do No Mow May, you can discover beautiful surprises, support pollinators, create a wildlife haven, increase ecosystem resilience, and store carbon in soil. And soil is the main focus of this talk today. So thinking about not only what's happening above ground that's so important, but also below ground. And I have 4 guiding questions for our talk today. The first is I think most of us have heard above ground biodiversity is really important. What about below ground? Is biodiversity below ground important too? The next question is, how does soil health, including biodiversity, connect with Lincoln's climate goals? And I know not everyone here is from Lincoln, but I think a lot of our towns have similar climate goals. Number 3 is, why are ground covers important from an ecological perspective? And the last question is, how can ecologically informed gardening seed hope and plant change? So we'll try to answer all 4 of those questions. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions too. So starting with the first question, we know above ground biodiversity is important. What about below ground? And I am a soil microbial ecologist. And so when I think about soil, I don't think of just dirt and dust and yucky mud. I think, which actually I love playing in the mud, but I think of life. I think it's so alive. And this, even though I know it, it blows my mind every time I think about this fact, which is that if you take a tablespoon of healthy soil, there are more organisms in that 1 tablespoon than people on the entire earth. So soil is just absolutely teeming with life. It's just so small that you don't see a lot of it. And soil life is really cool. These are some more charismatic members of the soil life community. One is tardigrades, or you might hear them called water bears. They especially like moss, but they live in the soil too, and they can survive in outer space. And then there's a neat example here of a nematode, which is kind of like a little worm. And there's a fungal hyphae, which is like a thread of fungi that wraps itself around the nematode, and even though it's much skinnier, it can expand and strangle the fungi and eat it. So it's just a lot of interesting interactions, drama happening in the soil. And we need a microscope to see it because it's so small, a lot of it. And so this is an example of some of the diversity of the organisms that you might encounter in the soil. So everything from earthworms that we're so familiar with, to tons and tons and tons of bacteria, to soil viruses. There's a lot of new research on soil viruses and what role they might play. We're just starting to learn about them. Fungi play a really, really important role in the soil. All these organisms are living in the soil and interacting with each other and interacting with plants and above ground life. And until last year, we didn't really know how diverse the life in soil was. Numbers were thrown around like maybe 25% of biodiversity on Earth was in soil, which is already a pretty big number. But then this really important paper came out in 2023, and they found that soil actually has nearly 2/3 of all species on Earth. They live in soil. So they said soil is the singular most biodiverse habitat on Earth. And the paper, which I loved, really highlighted that that means that it's really important that we think about soil when we think about conservation efforts. And this is a figure from that paper. And so each circle is like a pie chart, and the orange is showing what percent of different types of species live in the soil. So 59% of species overall live in the soil, and we can see that most fungi on Earth live in the soil, most plants live in the soil, about half of bacteria live in the soil. And as I said before, those organisms in the soil are all interacting with each other. They're eating each other, they're competing with each other, they're using the nutrients from each other. They have beneficial symbiotic relationships, they have competitive relationships. It's a very complex food web in the soil. And the two things that I really want to highlight are that these food web interactions help support life above ground. And that's the plants that are growing in the soil are one of the base levels of that food web. And so plants are providing food for a lot of the organisms in the soil, either through their roots and through what are called root exudates, which are carbon-rich compounds that are being released through the roots into the soil, or from that decaying plant matter entering the soil. So that is one of the most important base components or first trophic levels of the soil food web. And biodiversity is critical for healthy soils. So this is an illustration. So it's a little bit dramatic, but unhealthy soils look very unhealthy. You think about the Dust Bowl of the 1920s, and this picture has kind of a Dust Bowl like picture off to the left. And unhealthy soils require, because they're so unhealthy, a lot of nutrient inputs for anything to grow on them, because they're not holding water well, they don't have a lot of nutrients, they don't have a lot of soil life. And on the right side, we have this beautiful field of biodiverse wildflowers. You can see the roots go really deep, which is bringing carbon down deep. It is nurturing this rich, biodiverse underground food web, and everything is thriving, and it doesn't need chemical inputs to thrive. The biodiverse food web is helping cycle the nutrients that the plants need, holding the water that the plants need to grow. And I just want to say here with this image too, that with the idea of chemical inputs, especially pesticides and herbicides, now that we know that underground biodiversity is so fundamental, just think about how pesticides and herbicides harm that underground life. So we really need to think about all those organisms that are living in the soil and how to nurture them. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture talks about soil health and the principles of soil health. So a healthy soil is a soil that is providing, it's usually defined as sort of a human-centric. It's like providing the food and fiber that we need. But a healthy soil is a soil that has a good texture, it's holding water, it has lots of nutrients, it's really supporting life. And one of the fundamental four principles of soil health is to maximize biodiversity. So they have identified that biodiversity is really critical to healthy soil. And one of the reasons is because if you have more biodiversity, you have more soil organic matter. And I just want to take a second because soil organic matter is a really important concept to talk more about what that means. So this is on the left, what's called a soil profile. So it's like you take a slice of the soil, and in this slice of the soil, you have different soil horizons. Those are the layers. It's like a layer cake. And the top is the organic horizon, and that has the most carbon. And the organic horizon is going to be deeper if you have more deep-rooted plants. So deeply rooted perennials have deeper roots. They're going to have more carbon going deeper down, and you tend to have a greater carbon rich organic layer versus like turf grass in a lawn doesn't have very deep roots. You'd have a smaller organic layer. Then you have the topsoil, which is organic rich soil. And then you go more and more towards more minerals and then down to the bedrock. And the soil is made up of the weathering bedrock. So little bits of minerals combined with all this organic matter. And so as you go deeper down in the soil profile, you go from higher concentration of carbon to a lower concentration of carbon. And the organic matter in the soil is made up of carbon, and it's made up of nutrients. And those are from decomposing plant, animal, and microbial material. And so that's what, when you hear organic matter, that's what it is it's different stages of decomposition, rich in carbon, rich in nutrients. When you hear about soils storing carbon, that's usually in the form of organic matter. And that's sort of, people will sometimes distinguish organic from inorganic. We don't have so much inorganic carbon, but if you were in an area with a lot of limestone, that has inorganic carbon. But organic carbon is the decomposing plant, animal, and microbial material. So back to biodiversity. So organic matter is really important for healthy soils because it gives a better soil structure. It's made up of a large percentage of carbon. So more organic matter means more carbon in the soil. It has a better water holding capacity and better water flow because of that better soil structure. So it is going to, that soil is going to hold more water and do better in a drought, but it also, because it can hold more water and water can flow through better, it's going to do better in a flood as well. And it helps filter out pollutants. The other things that happen when you have more biodiversity is more cycling of critical nutrients. Bacteria and fungi especially are really, really critical for cycling nutrients so that they're available for plants. And so if you have more bacteria and more fungi in the soil, you have more cycling of those nutrients so that they're available for the plants to use. And more resilience to disturbance. So if you think about a field of only corn and then a disease comes through that wipes out your field of corn, you have nothing. But if you have a diverse field with lots of different crops, then maybe your corn fails, but your other crops survive. And you think about that in a natural ecosystem too. That happens whenever there's a disturbance like disease or a weather-related disturbance. Having more biodiversity means that more of that ecosystem is going to be able to weather or be resilient to different disturbances. Okay, so biodiversity is really important for healthy plants. And there's, for example, this great book, Grow Your Soil, Harness the Power of the Soil Food Web to Create Your Best Garden Ever. And I really like the cover of this. There's a picture of a worm that says, let us do the work for you while you take a nap. And it's true that when you plant biodiverse ecosystem, there might be some initial upfront work getting it established, but once you have healthy soil and high biodiversity, a lot of the work is done for you by that soil life. It doesn't need as much of you taking care of, adding all these nutrient inputs to it because it's already cycling those nutrients naturally. And a lot of plants rely on the soil microbiome to grow. There are some pathogenic microbes that harm plants, and there are lots of microbes that don't really hurt the plant, don't really specifically help the plant. But there also are a lot of really, really important plant beneficial microbes. And these are microbes that are helping the plant by releasing growth hormones. They're helping the plant by accessing critical nutrients. They're helping the plant access more water in the soil. And they even can help the plant fight off pathogens. So there's a lot of interest in this now. And people will do things like add microbial inoculums coated on seeds or to their soil as mycorrhizae. And there's a lot of research focused on this because it's been recognized that plants grow better when they have a community of beneficial microbes helping them grow. Biodiversity is also really important for healthy communities. So we are all linked together on the planet, and biodiversity, I love this chart on the left, which focuses on human health, but I think that we can sort of see it as like whole communities too, that biodiversity is really at the root of all of our health together as humans, as a community on Earth, that biodiversity helps give us better water quality, better air quality, better nutrition. It's really important to have biodiversity, and it can bring communities together, like in the picture on the right at the bottom. And I think that that's something, and I'll be talking about that later, that with all of the concern right now about climate change and biodiversity loss, we can have a lot of hope from coming together as communities and from restoring biodiversity. And we can see, as much as we can see the effects of climate change causing a lot of destruction, I think that it's incredible how much just like a pollinator garden that people come together as a community and plant can heal that and restore that environment in just a couple of years. So biodiversity is also really important for a healthy planet, and thinking about how biodiversity helps combat climate change. So if we think about how carbon is stored in soils, the sun provides solar energy. The plants use that sun energy through photosynthesis, and they convert carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into carbon that's part of their plant structure. And that carbon then enters the soil. It can enter the soil through dying, decaying plant leaves, plant tissue, but also a lot of it, as I said earlier, is actually actively pumped into the soil through what are called soil exudates. And that in itself is pointing to how important the soil life is to plant growth. The plant is willing to give some of its carbon to those microbes because it knows that they're going to give back the nutrients it needs, the protection against pathogens it needs. Those really important symbiotic relationships are happening. And so the plant is actually feeding a lot of those microbes carbon through those exudates. And then the carbon in the soil, a lot of it is dead microbe bodies. So if you have more microbes, more biodiversity, you have more carbon stored. There also was a really important paper that came out a couple of years ago that said that diversity gives a lot more complexity to the soil, and the more complexity of different types of carbon compounds in the soil, the more is going to stick around in the soil. So if you want to store more carbon in the soil, take it out of the atmosphere, store it in the soil, help combat climate change, biodiversity is really critical. The other thing that biodiversity does that's really important is it increases resilience to climate change. So like I mentioned before, as we have more unpredictable weather, potentially more disease, having more biodiversity is going to provide a lot more ecosystem resilience that can handle those kind of fluctuations that we might see in the future and are already starting to see. And biodiversity is very important. And we know that it's on the decline. And so we see here this chart where biodiversity is declining over time, And we're at this important point where if we do nothing, it will just keep declining. But we can do something and change it. We can turn it around. And that means more conservation efforts, more sustainable production, more sustainable consumption. And this chart doesn't show, it's showing all above ground biodiversity. But again, there's all this below ground biodiversity that's really important too. So the choices that we make are going to impact both above and below ground biodiversity, and we can make a positive impact on turning this around and having more biodiversity in the future. Okay, so above ground biodiversity is important, so is below ground biodiversity. How does soil health, including biodiversity, connect with Lincoln's climate goals? So Lincoln just came up with a climate action plan, and most of the surrounding towns near us also have come up with climate action plans. And if you haven't seen it yet, it's really, I think, fantastic. And there's a whole website to look at it. If you go online, you can see all the strategies and the stakeholders and how they came up with the plan and the goals. And I wanted to highlight two different aspects of the plan. The first is that Lincoln's climate is changing and is going to continue to change with climate change. So we can expect higher temperatures, more large storm events, and more annual precipitation, but also more frequent droughts. So our climate is changing, and that resilience component that we get from having biodiversity is going to be even more critical moving forward. We need to have ecosystems that can handle these changes, and a biodiverse ecosystem, especially one that has a lot of soil organic matter that can hold water in a drought so that the soil doesn't dry out as much, but can also filter that water quickly if there's a flood with more precipitation, is going to be really, really important. I also wanted to point out, and there's a link at the bottom for the website if you, and this is all being recorded, if you want to see the different strategies. But there are lots of wonderful strategies. A lot of them are in the natural resources. And I just wanted to point out that two specifically relate to what we're going to be talking about, which is planting native plants for climate resilience. And that's because diversity above ground seeds below ground biodiversity. If we think back to that soil food web from earlier, the plant is determining what is sort of the carbon compounds, the food sources for a lot of that underground food web. And so by choosing certain plants, native plants in particular, we can help have a more biodiversity below ground, and also have more biodiversity above ground means more soil organic matter. So 2 summers ago, we had a drought, and in Diana's garden, where she has this beautiful pollinator garden full of native plants, she didn't have to really water. Her plants did great. Where I have lawn, the grass died in a lot of places. It was not doing very well. But these native plants, they really do improve the soil health and the below ground biodiversity. And it makes a really big difference when we have climate fluctuations. Okay, so there are lots of things we can do to increase below ground biodiversity, but one of them is planting ground covers. So I'm going to talk about ground covers as important from an ecological perspective. And the Wild Seed Project has done a lot of really, I think, fantastic work on ground covers and why ground covers are important. They have this book, Native Ground Covers for Northeast Landscapes. A lot of that information is also online. And if you're interested, I really recommend it. And they say in their guide, to build biodiversity, it is helpful to think in 3 dimensions. And I love that. Native ground covers lay a literal foundation for a larger, vibrant system in which plants work together, like in a forest. And in my mind too, I think they're talking about this 3-dimensional above ground, but I'm thinking, it extends below ground too. The roots are just as important. And all those interactions that those roots are going to have with the below ground life is very important. So ground covers are like a living mulch, and one of their really important roles is they retain moisture. And it's kind of like the example of the three sisters, which I have on the right. So we have corn or maize, beans, and squash. And the squash is kind of like the ground cover, where it's covering the ground, it's holding in moisture, it's improving the soil quality by adding organic matter to the soil and retaining that moisture so that the other plants, the maize and the bean in this example, don't need as much water. Ground covers also support a lot of really important wildlife in that leaf litter sort of top part of soil, right where the leaves are falling, where decaying plant material is. Having ground covers there really holds that layer in, and that layer is super critical for a lot of beneficial insects, a lot of pollinators, a lot of organisms overwinter there, and the ground covers are really holding in that leaf litter layer and allowing a lot of above ground wildlife to thrive. They also add more carbon to the soil, more organic matter, which enhances soil health. And in choosing ground covers, it's really best to choose native. And the reason to choose native plants is because if we think about, again, plants as the base of the soil food web, our above ground and below ground wildlife evolved with these plants. So there are a lot of really important interactions we think about. For example, the interaction of monarchs with milkweed, and they need that milkweed. It's so critical to so many stages of their life cycle. And there are similar kinds of interactions that happen below ground. For example, there's a mycorrhizal fungi species that is critical for lady slipper orchids around here to grow. They need that fungi to grow. That's why they're so rare, is they'll only occur if there is this particular mycorrhizal fungi that grows there. So we have a lot of both above ground and below ground relationships where the organisms that we have in our environment have evolved around particular plants. So by planting those native plants, we're going to support a lot more biodiversity throughout the food web above and below ground. Another thing that I really love that the Wild Seed Project does is in their guide and also online, and this is another ecological concept, is to plant in guilds. So choosing natives is really beneficial for thinking about biodiversity. Choosing guilds is another way to think about biodiversity, which is kind of like you hear a lot of gardeners say, right plant, right place, or right place, right plant, with the idea that you don't want to put something that needs full sun into the shade because it's not going to thrive there. And so this idea of guilds is that you can choose native plants that are going to do well in the conditions that you have. And then you can choose assemblages, biodiverse assemblages of plants that are going to work together well, where you don't have one that will over the years totally outcompete all the other plants. Hopefully you're going to be able to have a couple different plants working well together and growing well together. So this is a great way to choose groups of plants that are going to grow well together and support each other. Okay, so thinking about how to do this at home. And I think this is just, to me, this is really hopeful. Whenever I get kind of bogged down worrying about climate change, I love that planting beautiful flowers can also help combat climate change, help with biodiversity. I think that it's really exciting. So I just wanted to say first, this year, if you've done No Mow May before, or even if you haven't done No Mow May, you can think about going beyond just simply not mowing for May and add in some ground covers. And so ground covers are an opportunity to go further, supporting more above and below ground life, storing more carbon, and further increasing ecosystem resilience. And there are a couple of ways to do it. One is, one thing that we've talked about in Lincoln Common Ground, and I've heard other people say, is think about lawns as an area rug instead of wall-to-wall carpeting. So we encourage people, if there's a part of your lawn that you can convert into a meadow or a pollinator garden, that's fantastic. If you still have a section of your lawn that you really want to keep as lawn and it has a functional purpose, then we're not saying, oh, you have to get rid of everything, you can't have any lawn, but then maybe think about diversifying it, increasing biodiversity. So this is a picture of Bryn's lawn, and it is covered in these beautiful violets, which are native, and they are diversifying it. Now we have a pollinator source for above ground pollinators. We have more diversity of carbon compounds entering the soil, which is going to increase the biodiversity underground as well. So as much as you could just take some plugs of native plants that are going to do well with the grass and add them into your lawn, that's going to really help. You can create, instead of a regular lawn, what's called a tapestry lawn. So instead of having it made of turf grass, which really has very little sort of ecosystem benefits, you can choose plants that are going to have ground cover plants that will have more ecosystem benefits. And it's, I think, really beautiful, and create this tapestry lawn instead. And then in places where you're able to forego your lawn, the ground covers, thinking in 3 dimensions again, lay the foundation. They're this living mulch, which is better than wood chips or gravel. You have a living mulch, living roots, supporting above and below ground life, holding in moisture, adding organic matter, laying the foundation for a thriving ecosystem in your pollinator garden. And if you're thinking about places to do this, one particularly important place is under trees, because those are really important in terms of thinking about pollinators and beneficial insects. A lot of them have an important stage of their life cycle. A lot of caterpillars in particular will overwinter in the leaf litter under trees. So you could think about maybe under your trees, you turn into a little pollinator shade garden zone, or maybe on the edges of your lawn, you let your lawn shrink a little bit and you start to plant some more pollinator friendly plants on the edges. And then where you leave it as a lawn, you could think about a tapestry lawn or diversifying it by adding in some plugs. Okay, so yes, ground covers are important from an ecological perspective. And I think that using this form of ecologically informed gardening and changing the way we're thinking about gardens, thinking about a pristine lawn to this, which to me is so much more interesting and beautiful, can really seed hope and plant change. So we're shifting our focus from thinking about planting for things looking uniform, planting for things looking like this more stylized beauty, to thinking about planting for biodiversity, which I think is still beautiful. And it really opens your eyes, or at least it has for me, to thinking about noticing the world around me more, noticing all the pollinators coming, the birds, the insects. It's really exciting to me to see that. And it really makes a difference. And you don't have to have a lawn to do this. You can put plants into containers, choose native plants, set up some containers. If you have access to community land or decisions being made about community land, you now have this knowledge about how important both above and below ground biodiversity are, and you can share that knowledge and try to affect change. And I think that ecological gardening is just, again, so beautiful. This is Diana's garden, again, moving into the fall. And unlike a more traditional garden or a more traditional lawn that doesn't look very interesting as we move into fall and winter, the other thing that I think is exciting about these ecological gardens is that they have year-round interest and also year-round ecological benefit, supporting life above and below ground. And a place to begin is that the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust does an annual plant sale. And this year, there will be plugs of a lot of really beautiful native ground covers. So there will be wild geranium, wild strawberries, wild ginger, foam flower, woodland phlox, Pennsylvania sedge, and dwarf crested iris. Some other places, if you're looking for native plants, are the Native Plant Trust at Garden in the Woods. There are a lot of places online where you can buy potted plants or seeds, like Prairie Moon. And I think that when we send out the recording, we'll send a list of different nurseries that are really great for natives. Wild Seed Project is a great place to get seeds for native plants. If you go to a nursery around, it's just always good to ask, is this really the native species or is it a cultivar? Because the native species is going to have more beneficial interactions than a cultivar. And it's also important to check that no herbicides or pesticides were used, because then you actually might by accident end up hurting some of the pollinators or some of the below ground life. So it's always good to just talk to people if you go to a nursery and ask, and more nurseries are carrying native plants and are carrying pesticide and herbicide free plants. And the more we ask for it, I think the more they'll provide it. And so I've really focused on the soil and below ground biodiversity. There's going to be a fantastic talk coming up on native lawn alternatives with a big focus on ground covers and how-tos of planting ground covers, presented by Alexis Docius, the nursery manager for the Native Plant Trust, coming right up on Tuesday, April 2nd at 7. And that's going to be hybrid at Bemis Hall in Lincoln, and also on Zoom. And that is hosted by the Lincoln Garden Club in coordination with the LLCT and, oh, I'm sorry, I think I cut off the text there, but Lincoln Common Ground. And you can also participate in No Mow May and learn more about No Mow May from lincolncommonground.com. And we're going to have signs coming out. We'll send out announcements when the signs are ready, but we last year had them available at Codman Community Farm Store. And I think that we'll have them there again this year. So you can let your neighbors know that you're doing No Mow May and spread the word. And so that is all that I have to say. Thank you so much for coming to listen. And we're going to open it up to questions. And we have, I'm really a soil expert, but we have some amazing ecological gardeners who are part of Lincoln Common Ground. And actually, I have had a lot of help from Diana Rice Shahan, who is going to be on, and she has an ecological gardening business called Monarch Meadows. Is it Monarch Meadows?
Monarch Meadows. And
Thank you. Monarch Meadows,
yes.
which we are using, and she's amazing, and I highly recommend her. So there are lots of great resources in Lincoln for doing this kind of ecological gardening.
Rachel, thank you so much for your incredible talk and for helping open our minds and how we look at land. I mean, who can look at land the same way now that we've seen your fantastic presentation? And also thank you for helping us seed hope and plant change, which is so important. And so please raise your hand as Maria has, thank you. And also feel free to pose your questions in the chat, which Bryn is going to open for us. So thank you. Maria, would you like to start? Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, when and where is the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust plant sale?
I'll leave that to Bryn.
Yeah, I can take that one. Great question. We are changing it up this year. It won't be a pre-order sale. It will just be a day of sale. And we're looking at the tentative date of May 18th, and it'll be in the morning. That's a Saturday in Lincoln. So if you're connected at all with Lincoln Common Ground or Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, as soon as we finalize the details, we'll be sending out information about when the sale is and what plants will be available.
Okay, thank you.
Great. There is a question in the chat, Rachel. Actually, this might also be for Robin and Diana as well. What ground covers would you recommend for planting over a septic system?
I'd recommend self-heal. I don't know how much, I mean, I'm assuming that you probably get a fair amount of sun there, and I don't know how damp it is, but self-heal is very adaptable. Wild strawberries would be a good candidate. They'll grow practically any place. So those are two that like sun. It depends on how tall you would like them to be, but those two are rather short. Violets are certainly versatile. And violets and wild strawberries are both keystone plants, and they will spread, as will self-heal. So you could do a tapestry of those three and it would look lovely.
Beautiful. Great. And now we'll go to Michelle.
Thanks.
Michelle Barnes, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I have not really
Are you frozen, Michelle? Oh, there you are.
oh, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Yeah, I've got a lot of land here that was a lot of lawn at some point, and I mow like once or twice a year, so I've been letting it go sort of wild. And I've got a lot of goldenrod, boneset, and aster that's popped up, and some violets and some clover. But I do still have, I guess, sod or thatch or grass. And I'm wondering what might outcompete that grass. I mean, goldenrod is pretty strong, right? So it's sort of amazing to me that well, actually, and I have great blue lobelia that's taking over too, which is lovely. But I do still have thatch and grass that is persistent. And I'm just wondering if there's something that's, maybe a little more aggressive, that might help conquest the grass and thatch more quickly. Thanks.
Is it somewhat damp there? Sounds like it might
Well,
be
it's all kinds of things.
lobelia. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the area where the great lobelia is going crazy is actually somewhat damp because it's like at the bottom of slopes.
Okay.
But some of it is on slope and some of it's at the top of slope, and some of the, there's a lot of varied conditions here, I'd say. So where the grass and thatch are typically maybe where it's wetter and slopier.
Yeah, wet and slopey, I would suggest violets. They seem to favor damper conditions.
Okay, and you just like put plugs in like the grass, and then it should, like, I don't know, outcompete, or not necessarily outcompete. Do I have to like eliminate all the grass to get it to outcompete?
If you eliminate the grass, you'll have to cover it with something because you can't leave the ground open. Something will definitely move in, but given time, the violets will definitely muscle their way into that area.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And that actually brings up, I think, a really important point, something that Lincoln Common Ground has talked about within our group a lot, of sheet mulching as a really great way to start establishing these native plants. If you look at some guides for how to grow native plants, they'll talk about tilling the soil or using herbicides to kill the weeds. And Lincoln Common Ground really favors sheet mulching. And that's something that you can, if you have questions about, you can ask any of us about. But the idea is that you're not disturbing the soil structure, you're not disturbing those soil microorganisms or adding in chemicals that would hurt the soil organisms. You're just adding layers of cardboard that's going to smother with things like wood chips or leaves on top. And Diana's really an expert at that and has lots of cool tips and techniques for how to sheet mulch. And it's been really effective for the members of Lincoln Common Ground who have done it.
Great. Judith, I see you. We're just going to jump back to the chat and then I will call on you afterwards if that's okay. Amy has asked, do native trees have more connections with underground organisms than non-native trees? And do native trees store more carbon than non-natives? Great question.
That's a really good question. I wish I had the exact answer. I would say yes for connections, more connections, and trees have a lot of, I don't know if you've heard of the term of the wood wide web, which some people debate, but I still like, and a lot of people still favor that idea of the the mycorrhizal fungi that are connected to the roots of trees are really important, and their networks extend through forests. The group that I did my research in, there's been a lot of work that we've done looking at not only are there connections from root to fungal hyphae, but also from fungal hyphae to bacteria. So it's whole food web that's very interconnected in the soil. And so native definitely has more connections because, like I said, they've all evolved together. Bacteria do evolve more rapidly because they have a faster life cycle, but I would still expect to see a lot more of the native species and more diversity and more connections with a native tree. In terms of carbon storage, I would expect that, but I don't know for sure. I would have to check that, but I would expect that more connections would mean more carbon storage, but I will look into that because that is a fantastic question.
Great. Thank you. Judith and the Commons Group, we're so happy to see you. Would you like to ask your question?
Henry Moss has a question for you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Henry, please.
Also asking this question. When we were removing invasive buckthorn from our woodland, it's amazing how the infestation of jumping earthworms is, how powerful that is, how continuous it is. How serious is it?
Yeah, it's really widespread, and Diana and Robin, feel free to jump on. I just wanted to say it seems like there's not a great solution for getting rid of them that I've heard yet. But native plants seem to be more resilient with them. And native plants have deeper roots and they tend to be more in the surface of the soil, the jumping worms. So going deeper can help the plant survive better because they really deplete the nutrients in the upper layers of the soil. So those deeply rooted native plants tend to do better with jumping worms. But I'll pass it to Diana and Robin if you have more to say. But yeah, it is a problem. It's really widespread.
Thank you.
Yeah, Robin, go ahead if you want to respond. That'd be great.
Just in my garden, how I'm dealing with it is just to completely add as much organic matter to the soil as I possibly can. Leaves, compost, manure, what have you. Just keep adding it because I feel that helps compensate. But there's a webinar tonight from the University of Rhode Island that I couldn't watch about the jumping worms, but I have somebody who is watching it for me and is going to take notes. So tomorrow I'll have more information, but right now it's what can I say? It's definitely a problem. But I like a lot of things. Diversity is always the way to go because something's going to come along which will be an antidote to it, hopefully. So I don't know, Diana, if you have other things to add.
I'd like to say that the jumping worms sort of highlight how important ground covers are because the native ground covers help retain some of those nutrients and they help prevent the erosion. And as an added bonus, especially if you have something with a broader leaf, it covers up the disgusting sight of those coffee grind looking, the evidence of the jumping worms, which is just when you look at it in your garden. So it's definitely a win-win with the ground covers.
Great. Thank you. And Sandra has asked, is now a good time to sheet mulch?
Yes. This is the time to do it. You sheet mulch now, and then you can plant into it in the fall.
Great.
Yeah, and a lot of the native plants can be planted in the fall. And the seeds, a lot of them need to germinate over winter.
The fall is a great time to plant because you don't have to water them very much, if at all, depending on your timing.
Great. And Margaret has asked, can you use clover as a ground cover? And if so, is red or white clover preferred?
I think clover is good in that it adds nitrogen to the soil, but it supports honeybees, and honeybees can be detrimental to our native bees, unfortunately. So I would go for something that's native. I'd go for, the violets, the strawberries, the things that just, I like to call them the party crashers. But you can buy them, but they're keystone plants, actually.
Great. I see you, Judith. Does the Commons have another question?
Yes, we do.
Great.
Kid Dryer has a question for you. Speak up, kid.
Oh,
What about upkeep? She said there seems to be a lot of weeding needed.
That's a great question. I think that one of the, and Robin and Diana, I'll let you speak more because Robin and Diana are really the garden experts here, but there's initial sort of establishment is a little bit more work, but then once it's established, especially if you sort of are thinking about, picking the right plant for the right spot, it needs not so much work after it's established.
Thank you.
I agree.
oh,
It's true.
wonderful. Are there, Maria is asking, are there any good amendments to the soil to feed and encourage underground life?
That's a great question. I would say that one of the most important sort of amendments is living roots, having living roots there, because those are adding to the organic matter in the soil, and that those root exudates, those carbon compounds that are being released into the soil are really important. And one thing that's actually really cool is the plant can actively kind of choose what it's releasing to the soil to be like, I want more nitrogen fixing bacteria. I really need some of these pathogen protecting bacteria. And if you go back to the USDA, where I had that, what's important for healthy soil, one of the biodiversity was one, living roots in the soil was one. That's why you hear a lot about cover crops is really important, and having like a winter cover crop on a agricultural soil. So the ground covers are providing that living root. So it's really just as much as you can have living roots, that's great. But the other thing is compost or manure. Organic matter really feeds a lot of the microbes too in the soil and helps feed that food web. So as much as you can be adding organic matter, leaving the leaves, adding leaf mulch, all of that is important for helping feed the below ground biodiversity. That's a great question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. This is from Michelle. If you sow seeds in fall, how do you protect the seeds from wildlife eating them or runoff if they are on slopes? Great question.
Well, I love Isabel Bailey, who I see is one of our members of Lincoln Common Ground, and she's been leading these fantastic workshops on milk jug, winter sowing of seeds. So you create these mini greenhouses in the milk jug, and the milk jug protects the seeds. There are other methods too. You can put like a mesh or a netting over them to help protect them. And I'll let Diana or Robin jump in, but if you see, I think all the workshops are done for this year, but next year, Isabel's workshops are fantastic. And she tends to do them at places like Codman, at Verrill Farm, all over. Really, really helpful workshops.
One trick that I've employed with some success is seeding in the fall and then surrounding the area with some sort of edging, like a corrugated edging, and then stretching bird netting over it. It keeps them from being able to access it and eat it. So.
And I know that the LLCT, they used like a straw mat over their native plant thing in Chapman Field. I don't know exactly what it is. Bryn, you know better.
We got it without realizing that it had some plastic netting as part of that. So we would not, that was a
Here.
we wouldn't do that again. But I think if there was a product that we found that was just the straw, we did that this fall, so we'll see this spring if it was effective at least.
Right, okay.
I think there are these like jute, like woven fabrics that you can get like mass quantities of. Is it sort of like that?
Yeah, that's what we were hoping it would be. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I've seen that. Thank you.
And Jennifer has asked, which plants have been the most successful? Oh, that was in response to Amy, wasn't it, Jennifer?
Yes, it was.
I'm so sorry. Amy wrote, I have replaced a shade garden of vinca and hostas with a wide variety of native shade ground covers, and I hardly have to weed at all. And there are great drought resistant varieties if you are on a hot city street. So Amy, we'd love to hear if you want to share which plants have been most successful.
Sure. So I've put in Allegheny Pachysandra, Dicentra eximia, native ginger,
Oh, pretty.
Hexagonum. I have ephemerals that come and go in that mix, like the native, that yellow poppy, Stylophorum, I forget the last name of that. I have Virginia bluebells. I also have Christmas fern and marginal wood fern and native beach fern, Jack in the pulpit. And, you know, some of these are in really big areas, so it just makes this nice big tapestry. And then there's other little plants that pop up. And I'm in Cambridge and I'm near a hot street. Some of these plants don't do well right on the street, but not too far from it. They do fine even during a drought, and they just make this beautiful tapestry. Oh, and Tiarella, Heuchera. There's just so many that do well.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you all. I just want to say thank you for your very thoughtful questions and your eagerness to engage with the living earth, both above and below ground, in a fresh, caring, and essential way. We'll send you a follow-up email with a recording of tonight's fantastic program. Thanks to everyone participating, and please join us in participating in No Mow May and more, and sign the No Mow May pledge, which is on our website, lincolncommonground.com. Have a wonderful evening. It has been a joy to be with you all. Thank you.